Welcome to Strait Forward, a podcast about Taiwan, the island at the center of technological innovation and the global fight for democracy. I'm Channing Lee.
And I'm Libby Lange. And today we are here to talk about Taiwan's democratization. And maybe we should start by talking about why we wanted to do this for episode 2.
Yeah, I think a critical part of Taiwan's story is the fact that it democratized, right? It was not always a democracy in the way that we know of it today. It actually has a very complicated history that can go all the way back. We might not be able to go all the way back in this short episode, in the short episode's time, but we thought it was really important before we have those conversations about Taiwan's national security, about the challenges it faces, vis-a-vis, of course, the People's Republic of China, economic security issues, supply chain security issues, right? All of these modern day issues that we are going to continue to talk about in this episode really hinge on a good understanding of Taiwan's history. And so contingent in that is a story of democratization, and it is a story that I think often gets lost in the headlines about Taiwan, right? Because you see, Taiwan, holds successful election, great, right? Or, Taiwan against all odds, or, despite China's or Beijing's, campaigns against Taiwan's democracy, right? All of these stories that you hear, what is Taiwan's democracy and how did that come about? I think these are some of the questions that we want to ask before we really get into that.
Yeah, and if anybody remembers from episode 1, when we tried to cover the whole of Taiwan's modern history in about 5 minutes, we had said that feels impossible. And so we really wanted to dedicate this entire episode to kind of digging further into that in more detail and highlighting some of those critical moments in Taiwan's history where things really could have gone very differently.
Yes, and so we have a very awesome guest today. He's a historian. But before we get into our conversation with our guest, we thought it would be very helpful to first signpost a couple of the terms that we might be using throughout the episode, just because, again, this is a very complex period of history. You have a lot of layers. And so what are some of the, terms? Let's do a glossary for our listeners first, right? So I guess first, when we think in terms of history, more modern day history, you have Japanese colonialism. This was a period between about 1895 to, 1945-ish to 49-ish. That's the period where, of course, the KMT came over, right? And so, that is important, right? Japan ruled over Taiwan for a very long period of time. And they, it was a very interesting type of colonialism, right? They both built a lot of the infrastructure in Taiwan, but also suppressed the people. And anytime it's a period of colonial rule, people, as our guest has told us in the past, aren't happy.
Even though it ended in 1945, right, it did have a lasting impact on how Taiwan organized its political system going forward and really how it felt about the ROC government that came to Taiwan in 1949, right? They may have had a very different reaction to that event had it not been for Japan's colonization of Taiwan for 50 years before that.
Yes.
So another term that we will probably cover multiple times in this episode is the White Terror, right? 白色恐怖. And this was a period of time from Taiwan that does not perfectly overlap with martial law, which extended for about 38 years. But this actually extends a little bit beyond when martial law was lifted in the late 1980s into the early 1990s. And so you can kind of think of this as Taiwan's really true authoritarian period where certain, political affiliations, ideologies were not legal, where freedom of speech was not protected in the way that we see it as today.
So the final term that we want to define in this glossary of terms is more of an ethnic distinction, and this is really important due to Taiwan's history, and a lot of people continue to see their lineage and family history through this lens, and it continues to define politics, perhaps in a diminishing way now in 2025, but it's definitely something that has defined politics over the last 25 years in Taiwan, and that is the distinction between 外省人 and 本省人. 外省人 is a term that they use to refer to, mainlanders, folks who migrated from mainland China to Taiwan with the KMT in 49 or around that period, and 本省人 is kind of more native Taiwan or people who were already on the island before that. And because that mass migration of the KMT and the rule that they had over the island really defined this next chapter of Taiwan's history, this Weishen and Benshen and distinction really continues to define how certain people see, the history. So I just wanted to put that out there. And as we use these terms, perhaps in English, maybe you can think of it more as mainlanders and Taiwanese.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that really ties in well to what we'll cover in this interview on how Taiwan's democratization is so tied to what Taiwan's identity is, like what it means to actually be Taiwanese, right?
So for today's episode, we wanted to bring in someone who can tell us that story of how Taiwan democratized, but also tell us the context around its democratization. And therefore, we found a really awesome historian based out of the University of Missouri. His name is Dominic Yang, Yang Mengshun from the Department of History. He's an associate professor at the University of Missouri, and he has written a book called The Great Exodus from China, Trauma, Memory, and Identity in Modern Taiwan. And we thought this angle of trauma and memory was just so fascinating because, again, in the modern day political context, it's really easy to think about this history of Taiwan as very partisan, right, with current blue-green dynamics. But, it is a period where a lot of people experienced immense trauma and loss, and these memories continue to define the way that people see themselves, view their own identity in Taiwan, and also reflect on their own history. So, so for today's episode, we're really excited to bring in Dr. Dominic Yang. Professor Yang, thank you so much for joining us, and we're really excited to hear your insights on the history of Taiwan. Just to get our listeners up to speed on your expertise, you're a historian of modern Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong, but also of political refugees, of trauma, and memory studies, which I think, Libby and I were trying to find the best guest to bring on to discuss this topic of democratization, and we thought your background was just so perfect, right? It's such a unique approach to history that you've taken, looking at trauma, looking at memory. So can you tell us a little bit about that background and why you chose to study the history of Taiwan and China in this way?
Thank you, Charlene, for introducing me to this program, and I'm happy to be on your podcast. Personal background. I was born and raised in Taiwan until I was 14 years old. Then my family emigrated to Canada. When the nationalist government from China defeated, in the Civil War came in, right? So, anyway, again, long story. I was fascinated because of my subject, my own subjectivity, as a person that always feel sort of displaced in the sense that, like you moving across the borders, and, of course I moved across the border when I was in my teenage years. And I've returned to Asia and see the difference, something that seems very familiar, but at the same time, also very alienating. And, moving from Vancouver to Columbia, Missouri, like the Midwest, right? That's also sort of a huge adjustment. You get some, like with any kind of these movements, right? You get, repeated culture shock in a way. And so, and this is why, I think, this idea of, the ideas of displacement and people getting shocked and sort of, as I put it, traumatized in a way, it's a constant theme in not only, of course, in the history of East Asia, right? During this time, there's a lot of war, colonialism, famines and stuff, but especially for the history of Taiwan.
And thank you for sharing that. And I definitely empathize, right, with that personal connection. And in many ways, I feel the same way and compelled to do that. And I think, the 1.5 generation that you mentioned, my parents' generation as well, right? There is that sense of migration. And also, when you leave a place that you had called home for so long, sometimes when you return, it's very different. And just thank you for sharing.
Yeah, but we just wanted to do this early episode of our podcast, really laying the foundation for this story about Taiwan with walking our listeners through the modern day history of Taiwan. And I'm sure that you know probably better than anyone else that any conversation about Taiwan's history and sort of where to start can be a very complicated question, right? There are many different starting points you could begin with. But I think for the purposes of today, and given what you were just saying about your own research into 1949, I think maybe that would be a great place to start, right? So 1949, the Republic of China government led by the nationalists, the Kuomintang. They arrived in Taiwan following a civil war with the Chinese Communist Party on mainland China. That war had been going on since around 1927. And Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, the leader of the Republic of China, fled to Taiwan with his army and about 1 million people. So that, again, is kind of a simple set of sentences to say, but when we were discussing this episode, we were actually thinking about what it would be physically like to, move with 1 million people to a new place and kind of take your government with you. And so I was wondering if you could maybe describe what that actually looked like in practical terms.
Yeah, I think that's a very sort of large question, right? So I think I can break it down into, several like larger points. The first one is that 1949 sets, we imagine it as sort of this historical watershed. The People's Republic of China was formed, the Civil War ended, and Chiang Kai-shek regime escaped to Taiwan, and so it was this 1 million people, mostly low-ranking soldiers and ordinary civilian refugees. And of course, they're seen by the local Taiwanese population as some kind of outside, colonial rule from the local perspective, right? And of course, it's the starting point of this divide. But then but there's very little about when you come to think of it, right? This historiography, like this, it's not only this watershed moment when you have what later on became the two Chinas. It's about actually people's lives. They're like moving around, right? And so, and we sort of, the second point is that, with that, we sort of proceeded in a sense that it's not a war, like but it's a revolution. In all of that, what's lost is actually this gigantic population movement, right? So the third thing I want to say about that movement is like if you want to sort of conceptualize in a way, it's one word: chaos. Extreme chaos, because it's a civil war, and there are like millions of people being displaced, and probably 5 to 6 million people die in that final stage of the nationalist and the communist struggle. And of course, there's this ongoing war in China, right? During the previously the Japanese invasion, killed about 20 million. So this, for people who live in China at the time, it's for them, there's no periodization. It's just continuation of, basically,
Yeah, that's a great
community
point.
getting burned. Yeah, if you're in the way, right? If you're in the actual war zone, like you need to sort of move. And for this 1 million who ended up in Taiwan, of course, a lot of them do have connections to the government. But at the same time, you have hundreds of thousands of these foot soldiers, teenage boys that were just mass kidnapped by retreating nationalist forces, wherever they go, especially on these last points, in the coastal areas where they have to get on boats to Taiwan, right? And you have civilian refugees wanted to basically escape, in a direction, in what they perceive as safe places, places without war. When everything blow over, they can return, right? And some of them didn't thought of returning because they heard that their own if there are people of some status, that their own land has been confiscated and a relative being killed by in the land reform process, and they're so afraid. Again, they become roaming refugees, and to survive, they sort of a lot of them just join these kind of army/refugee groups, like going to some place, and a lot of them just ended up in Taiwan. But but more actually, and this is a research that's never sort of done in a way, or it's done in that revolutionary frame, right? Like people ended up actually in the Chinese communist concentration camp and just die or languish there. And so in the historiography in China, this is called the land reform campaign and also suppression against the anti revolutionaries. 镇压反革命 1 to 2 million people die in that. This is the early years People's Republic. And for me, that periodization is problematic because I sort of see that as part of the continuous civil war for the communists to consolidate in China, right? And when you break down to the really personal level, right? The other than chaos, the other word I will use is diversity. Because you do have, and usually separated by the social class, because you do have people like, families of wealthy politicians or socialites from Shanghai, Ningbo, Guangdong, and even some of the northern cities that has some connections with the regime, or they're just very rich. And these people got their family to places like Hong Kong and Taiwan first. So if you look at the numbers statistically, there's about a quarter of this 1 million that were already on Taiwan by the time, you get 1948. And they didn't experience the final collapse, because the final collapse was like, again, it's chaotic. Like people just don't know what's going on, and they're trying to basically survive this period, right? But you do have, people that were like, for example, like tens of thousands of officials and garrison troops that were already stationed on Taiwan. I would say like maybe 80% of the Air Force and their families, and then and all these like the personnels that support the Air Force were already on Taiwan by the time you get to like 1948, right? And again, these business people, these people with means, right? So diversity, I mean, that's how I would sort of frame it, right?
So you're saying that people basically moved from China to Taiwan via all transportation means, right? Via boat, via plane.
At different time
At
periods.
different time
I think
periods.
the periodization point is actually so interesting because even the way I framed the question, I was really thinking of it as sort of
it just
black
happened.
and white. Yeah, it was, these people were in China and then they were in Taiwan in 1949. And as you said, that's for many, many people, that was actually not their experience.
And which is why we want to know, when the jadeite cabbage, that's what you might say, that's on display at the National Palace Museum, do you know when how that survived and when that moved over?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's an aspect of the 1949 history, right? Again, you can write an entire book on the journey of these what's called 国宝 or national treasures of China, right? Because these are basically, cultural artifacts that's been passed down through maybe thousands of years of China's imperial history. They're, China's imperial treasures, right? 1933 was the year that it coordinated off the efforts by the Nanjing government and also some of these warlord governments in the north. Of course, they didn't want these artifact to leave Beijing, but the idea is that if the Japanese ever move in, they'll pretty much just pack everything and have them shipped to Japan, right? So as Chinese collectively, they couldn't have that happen, right? And so
It's just impressive
it's
the
an
amount of
incredible
planning
journey.
that goes into this.
Yeah.
And so originally they have 20,000 they were put in those 20,000 wooden boxes.
Wow.
And just ship all across the Nanjing and later on all the way inland to Sichuan and Guizhou. They even keep it away from Chongqing because they know that it's going to be like Chongqing is going to be bombed, right? So it's all these in these caves. And then afterwards, it returned to Nanjing after all of that shipped downriver to Nanjing. And by the time, I think it was in the mid 1948, when the Civil War is not really going well with the nationalists, that's the time when Chiang Kai-shek, like in consultation with the historians and all these other people, and there was actually a group of people that were actually in charge of taking care of these.
Wow. It sounds like we're going to have to do an episode
I know, just on these
artifacts.
treasures.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, quick early plug for our listeners to go to the National Palace Museum to see these treasures. But, again, the fact that, all that chaos was happening, right, at the same time as
Hmm.
as this really coordinated shipment of national treasures, I think is just so fascinating and quite a dichotomy. But just to kind of move along in history, right? So this huge exodus, as you wrote about in your book and as we've been discussing, occurred over a period of time. But the Kuomintang and those 1 million people, they weren't just arriving to an empty island, as you mentioned.
Hmm.
There were people already living there. They had just,
Hmm.
I guess, experienced Japanese colonial rule, but they still, they
Hmm.
had their families, they had their economies. So what was it like for, it was traumatic, of course, for people who moved over from mainland China, but what was the trauma like for people who were already on the island, and how did the KMT, take control of the island and their government?
Yeah, and I think, that's one of when you're talking about Taiwan history, is it related to, later on democratization and also identity formation, the formation of Taiwan's national identity. It's really important to understand the Japanese like colonial period of Taiwan from like 1895 to 1945, right? And also, what happened to this group of people that we call today the native Taiwanese, and how they experienced the colonial rule and how the colonial rule have changed them. Of course, colonial rule is not fun, right? Although uh, Taiwanese today do have very sort of, in a sense, very fond memory of that colonial rule because they think about, the modernization, the Japanese built infrastructure, modern cities, hospitals, railways and hydroelectric power dams to power all the cities. So there was this amazing colonial modernity
Yeah, and a lot of
that
the
people
streets
tend
were
to
named
really,
after or structured in the same way, right?
yeah. And so the Japanese, I mean, again, I'm not trying to sort of whitewash, any colonial rule that would you have. What you have at the very beginning is very brutal suppression of anyone who would object to that colonial rule, right? So it took the Japanese about 10 years, and to deal with the various populations, including the indigenous people, like deep in the mountains, and then they really want to basically just get control of that last frontier of Taiwan. But after they did that, right, it's like the goal to turning the Taiwanese into Japanese, and also the fact that basically just modernize the island, build infrastructure, and of course, Taiwan is a place for the importation of Japanese into a net zero project and also exportation of agricultural products. So Taiwan really was seamlessly integrated into the Japanese colonial empires. And if you understand all of this, then you fast forward to 1945, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we all hear about this narrative of the Taiwanese really happy that they are liberated finally from the army from the motherland is going to come and take over, and they're no longer the colonial subjects. And in a sense that but if you're Taiwanese, right, of course, you're extremely nervous and ambivalent about the situation because in your mind, you're Japanese subjects, but you're lesser Japanese subjects, you're second class citizens. So it is sort of in that context that um, when the nationalists came in, the Taiwanese initially were like, they're very worried. But then, the message of the nationalists was like, look, we come to liberate you, and the Qing government give you away, but now we have you back. Now you're no longer the second class citizen, and we're going to have like elections, and you can get representative in this Republic of China constitution. We're actually making in Nanjing, and you'll be treated equally because, after all, you're also Chinese. We're like brothers. But then, that turned out to be a disaster. A year and a half down the road. And of course, there are different ways to look at it. You'd be like, the Taiwanese, after when they experience both the Japanese, and this is where that nostalgia for the good old times under Japan came from, right? And again, and if you imagine yourself being colonial subjects, you're not happy. You're you have to really, if you work in colonial Taiwan, even your managers are always Japanese, your superiors are always Japanese. Even if you work in the same job, you're paid less than the Japanese, right? And that goes the same for the ethnic Chinese and also the indigenous population were even more suppressed and looked down upon, right? So, of course, the Taiwanese were not happy and they want to be treated as equals, right? But the reason why that nationalist experience for them was so traumatizing was that it gave them this huge hope that they can achieve that. But later on, when they discover that the nationalist rule was a lot worse than the Japanese, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of problems, and again, I say there are different ways to look at it. If you want to blame the nationalist regime, but then you have to look at their performance in China as well. They're fighting the civil war. And so they're draining all the areas under their control for all the resources that they can get. In particular Taiwan, because Taiwan was not touched during World War II. And it has all these facilities that were really well constructed by the Japanese. It does have all this reserve food and then war materials, and the nationalists took as much as they can. And economically, that made the Taiwanese the lives very difficult. They set up all these monopolies to control all the commodities. I mean, in the logic of the nationalists, they're doing this to all the other places in China, not just Taiwan, right? So they're not treating Taiwan, but that's also how they lost the entire China, because the policy were really bad. It's not accepted by everyone in China. And in Taiwan, it caused this uprising in early 1947 that came to be known as the 228 incident, or the Taiwanese specialists now, if they want to call it, the 228 massacre, right? Because the protest started on February 28th and then over a very small incident in Taipei, but then it quickly spread to the entire island because by that time, the anger of the Taiwanese were boiling, right? What the Taiwanese really wanted is for nationalists to stick to their words.
Don't
Give
overpromise.
us
Yeah.
local elections. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair
yeah.
local, not rigged local elections. Introduce us into your national community fairly, right? But instead, the Chiang Kai-shek did what again, if you look at it, right, in the confines of Taiwan history, he's this evil person. But if you look at it in a larger scope, in the scope of the Civil War, he did this all the time. And so the solution of Chiang Kai-shek was that, why don't I just send some army over there and just purge these people? And so you got, 1 or 2 months of these basically a bloodbath and mass arrest, right? And so, yeah, that's pretty harsh. And then that get extended into, when the nationalist regime move over, in 49, and the same sort of suppression of Taiwanese sort of resistance continues. And by that time, the Taiwanese resistance has really morphed into becoming cells of these radical communist part, underground in the 1950s. And you can see why, right? I mean, these Taiwanese will be like, well, you have you have a lot of us killed, but a lot of us can continue to resist. And we draw inspirations from China because the communists has sort of beaten you, and we wait for another round of liberation. And this is, again, nowadays, Taiwanese historiography, when you talk about independence, Taiwanese identity, that's a stretch of history that the Taiwanese historian will talk about the 228. Then we'll talk about the White Terror. But throughout the 1950s, is that the first couple years of 1950s, right? Most of the people that were executed by Chiang Kai-shek's regime, who were Taiwanese, were actually all underground communist members. And this time, it's actually organized. by the and facilitated by the Chinese Communist Party. And it's interesting because it happened in the wake of the 228. Like the 228 is actually not caused by the communists, but because of that
Huh.
hammer down and the Taiwanese feeling of injustice. Of course, that's also I would say that a lot of Taiwanese elites, the ones that didn't turn communist, had this idea that maybe we should have Taiwan independence, right? And we should get ourselves out of this situation.
Yeah, I would love to actually pull on that thread of suppression and what that looked like for people. Of course, Taiwan had one of the longest periods of martial law in world history following the arrival of the KMT government on Taiwan. It ran, martial law ran from 1949 to 1987, so 38 years in total. And I think actually one of the first times I really sort of came to understand Taiwan's movement from authoritarianism to democracy was when I was in college in Taiwan and, in my political science classes with professors, and we were reading some kind of foundational, Western political philosophy books. And my professor just kind of offhand said, oh, when I was in college, we had to smuggle these into Taiwan. These actually weren't we weren't legally allowed to have these books, but we wanted to read them, so we would kind of like print them ourselves. And that's really when I realized, martial law is something that was probably felt in the lives of people in many different ways. And I would love if you could talk a little bit about that everyday experience.
Yeah. So martial law, or some Taiwanese historian will call it the period of White Terror. Um, it's 38 years. As you said, Libby, that's one of the longest in modern world history, right? A society sort of live under martial law. And it's also quite complex in a way. You have to look at different periodization and the different group of people that the nationalists actually targeted against. And again, we can sort of segue from late 1940s, the 228, and then the Great Exodus, towards the early 1950s, and you can see, what the nationalists try to do, right? Imagine that your government just basically and your army was destroyed in China, and all these nationalist leaders, when they got to Taiwan, quite, they're in a very sort of, you're not in a good mood, right? And you're also in this kind of existential kind of thinking, like, this is it. This is the last piece of land we got, we can't retreat into the Pacific Ocean. And also in late 40s and early 50s, at least until 1951, until the outbreak of the Korean War, right? So that's mid 1950. The U.S. support for the nationalists wasn't really that solid, right? There was a period of time when Truman was the president at the time, and he said, or his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said that very famous line, right? Well, just let this dust settle and see what happens, right? If the communists, would take over Taiwan, they will take over Taiwan. Then they will take over Taiwan, then we'll try to deal with it, right? And so the nationalist regime was in a very precarious situation, right? And so, of course, the suppression, and again, the great exodus, right? It's chaos. You have no one so you have this memory of you see that most of the Taiwanese are not happy with me, because they rebelled asking for rights that I promised, and I didn't give it to them. And I responded with this huge over the top bloodshed so I can shut them up. Right. But now I'm in a very weak position. I do have this 1 million people who came with me, but you know what? A lot of them could be communist. I have no way. And this is like, when the Nationalist Army and party in China was so infiltrated, right? And these people just show their true colors at the very moment, say, hey, you know what? I'm communist. I'm not going to go with you to Taiwan. Good luck. And so, like, imagine yourself in that situation if you're Chiang Kai-shek and all these nationalist elite. They went very hard on people. When I say people, that includes these Taiwanese who continue to organize these underground resistance. They never stop. And so so one of the first things for the nationalists is like, yeah, we need to get things in order. And you see, when these communist sort of infiltrators were like sent from mainland China, they went to like organize local Taiwanese because they knew that they were like in the countryside because knew that there are huge resentments, right? And so this is the situation nationalists face with, right? And so that's where white terror started. It's like everyone is under suspicion, right? There used to be this line, like, be careful, the communist spy can just be right beside you, right? 小心飞碟就在你身边. So it's kind of this kind of, you talked about, the daily experiences of people, right? That's how, no matter who you are, even if you're like, if you're not someone who affiliated with the nationalists at the power, the center of the power, people that they can trust, even if you're a mainlander, you could be, and especially a source of suspicion, isn't it? Because you just came recently from China.
Yeah.
If I don't know who you are, like, again, long story short, in the 1990s, right? So they have this commission, and when the final tally came out, right? 45% were like mainlanders. The other 55, well, there's some Aborigines, but the other 55 were mainly the native Taiwanese. And that's a staggering statistics because mainlanders only 10% of the Taiwanese population, and they're 40% of the. Again, this is the regime is not targeting based on ethnic groups. It's targeting based on your ideology, because basically, like, if you're a communist or socialist, you try to overthrow the government, then you're the enemy, right? And so another point I want to sort of make, because I said periodization, right? But because as you sort of move down the period, it does get better. And you can say that the nationalists, did a pretty good job. The person that Chiang Kai-shek put behind this job was his son, Zheng Jingguo, because he couldn't trust anyone at the time. And of course, his son went to Soviet Union for 12 years. And he's like, in the back of his mind, he's like, I don't know if I can really trust you. And that really reflect on, his relationship with Cheng Qingguo while they're still in China. But I would say that because, it's like people say that when you're down and out, you know who your like true friends and enemies are. And Cheng Qingguo didn't stay in China, despite his history in the Soviet Union, right? He came to Taiwan to help his father. And he's a very able person, right? And again, he's also very able person when it comes to developing Taiwan's economy. But in the 1950s, that's what he's sort of remembered for, and to facilitate democratization later on. But people often forget that in the 1950s and 60s, the worst days of the White Terror were 80%. If you look at the White Terror, again, we tend to remember that people that in the 1970s were put in jail by the nationalists, and they're mostly Taiwanese. They're a new generation of Taiwanese who were born after World War II, and they rose up against the nationalists, right? But when you look at it statistically, there may be like 10% or less than 10% of the total number of people who actually put in jail by the nationalists and executed by the nationalists. Most of that happened in the first half of the late 1940s and the first half of the 1950s. And a lot of those are like Taiwanese communists and also the mainlanders, especially those ones are in their military, in which they went down on. They make sure that they control the art, like have consolidated their control for their party, for their army, and the Taiwanese population. Then they went after democracy protesters and also people who are actually advocating Taiwan independence inside Taiwan. So that's 1960s and 70s. And of course, a lot of these people, could only advocate these ideas, especially the Taiwanese, like overseas, either in Japan or the United States. So that's sort of, I basically sort of try to give you in a nutshell what white terror looks like. It's quite, as I said, quite diverse. And by the time we get to the 70s, that's where the economic development is kind of taking off, right? It's like China in the 80s or even in the 2000s. Right? The government is still very authoritarian, still put people that openly went against the government into jail or something. But, it's not as bad for regular people, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's how I will put it.
Yeah, in a nutshell, I mean, a lot to fit into a nutshell. I mean, we visited the National Human Rights Museum in Taipei
Mm,
recently, and I think that gives us also, I guess, in a nutshell as well, a very good image of what a lot of this looks like. So, also recommend our listeners to
mhm,
check that out. Just to, I guess, continue moving us along in history. And so you had this Dangwai movement, literally,
mhm.
opposition party outside of the party movement forming. So can you describe to us how this movement got its start and how they ended up pushing the government towards democratization?
Again, like fast forward to the 1970s, right? I mean, that's the democratization movement really started. It's more than a decade of sort of back and forth, right? Between, you know, Chiang Ching-kuo, trying to sort of hold back on these social and political movement, a society, I would describe it as a society in revolt. By the time we hit the 1980s, right? I said entire society, but a, a lot of the developments that make that happen actually happened in the 1970s. And if you look at this, like the string of events, right, that actually put the nationalists in a very difficult position. Of course, people will say, well, Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975. Okay, yeah, that's a big thing, right? The nationalists just lost the leader the longest time. But that in itself is not much of an existential crisis because at the time, the nationalists already basically established firmly their control of the island.
Mm-hmm.
There's really not a lot of enemies externally. And for people who like Taiwanese people who advocate Taiwan independence, they can, of course, they have a very vibrant society, but they can also do so overseas. And the nationalists put them on these, what's called the Heimingdan or blacklist, right? They cannot, they're persona non grata, right? It can't enter Taiwan or enter Republic of China at the time. And so, but the biggest thing that happened, of course, in the 1970s, starting was because Taiwan being kicked out of UN, right? And this was the time when the United States really shipped its sort of Cold War foreign policy. Nixon went to China in 1972, and of course, shortly before that, the ROC delegates just walked out of UN because they knew that they're going to be voted out. There's really no way for them to see, after losing the support of the United States. And so, but all of that did to the national, this is really serious, right? If you look at it. Because if you look at the national support, of course they have the army, right? And they have the US backing. So the Taiwanese couldn't really do anything to challenge them. Like even their government and the army is mostly at its high level stabbed by these mainlanders who came over from China in 49 and have this
Mm-hmm.
dream that they'll one day return to China and they're going to be the ruling class, right? You see, all of that is gone. Like, it's impossible, right? So that really put the nationalists now under Jiang Jingguo's leadership, right? In a very, very tough position. And of course, in our previous conversation, I did make that comment, right? And I still believe it, that no dictators in the world, whether they're first generation dictator, second generation dictator, whatnot, modern dictators will just wake up one day, say, hey, you know what? Today's a good day. Let's start democratizing.
Right.
If only.
It's just, yeah, no one in a right mind will do that, right? Because you don't know what could happen afterwards, right? And that the people that you kill, the people that you put in jail, the unequal distribution of power, especially Taiwan, right?
Mhm.
Um, so Chiang Ching-kuo was under a lot of pressure, and of course, in the 1970s, right, there's, these, starting these like social movements or rather debates within, this young generation of people, like, of course, they're Taiwanese, right? Remember I said that these people that are actually born. So, even for there's mainlanders and they're Taiwanese. But the mainlanders we're talking about right now, most of them were not born in China. They're born in Taiwan, right? Of mainland
New
parents, and
generation
sometimes there are a
of
lot of
Yeah.
intermarried.
white Shinran.
Yeah, it's the generation, right? And also these native Taiwanese and to a certain degree young indigenous people as well. Um, they because their predecessors, they didn't have some sort of power to fight against the nationalists. The international communities were not on their side. The U.S. was not on their side. They didn't have the language. They didn't really know how to operate in the national system, right? But now they do, because they had the same education as everyone else. And also, there's another factor, the economic factor, right? Because Taiwan economy just took off, right? Started the late 60s, export oriented industrialization. And it started as, if I can put it in very simple terms, the U.S. trying to make Taiwan pay for their own defense. Because the U.S. was, by the time, shifting,
Long
like
history of that.
gravitating very heavily towards Vietnam. But what happened in that takeoff? I mean, people like see you might have read those theories about like it's called the middle class theory or the modernization theory or the developmental state theory, right? Once you hit certain number of people that reach the middle class status, right? I mean, they're highly educated, they travel overseas to do business, or they were even educated in some of these American or European universities. They're going to come back to their own country or be in their own country and start asking for political rights from authoritarian regimes, right? I mean, yes, it did happen in Taiwan, but in a different way because of the ethnic elements in it. If you take a look at the Taiwanese society in the 1970s, the government and the military, of course, there are Taiwanese in the government and military, but the ones that had control were all senior mainlanders, right?
Yeah.
And they even have this parliament from China, which is elected in Nanjing, I think in the late 30s, right? And it's
Still
in
there.
Taiwan, they call it the 10,000 year parliament because, under martial law, you don't do elections. I mean,
Yeah, I guess
like
you
you
just stay
do
there.
elections when you, yeah, return to China and then, yeah. And so that for this new generation of people is that really absurd. And then, the majority of the population is still Taiwanese. So if you look at that ethnic divide in the sense that the Taiwanese were the ones that are benefited mostly from industrial growth and modernization. They're in businesses. They're the ones that have the money. They're the ones that have land to, get the initial capital to invest, right? And the mainlanders are like, they're displaced government officials and military personnel. And so although they all benefit from this economic development, but they do not become more powerful. On the contrary, in contrast to the Taiwanese, they become less powerful. And you really have to understand that shift in the power dynamics, right? And so all of a sudden, right, when all of this kind of social like agitation and fermentation get into the 1980s, and when people start showing up on the streets and just protesting and we put some of them in jail, their family just, get helped by the rest of the Taiwanese society. And there were Taiwanese capitalists actually putting money towards like sponsoring their family to run against the government candidates and win, and you have this happening all over the island. That's when and again, beyond that is this kind of unequal power relation started to shift, right? And if you're Chang Jingguo, you're like, okay, I need a sort of share power with the local Taiwanese. I need to come up with some way to indigenize the KMT. And so because, yeah, we're not going to go back to China. And the US is now basically, although you still have the Taiwan Relations Act, right? But they're now buddy with Beijing, my sworn enemy. So what am I going to do, right? And so that again, in a very simple and encapsulated way is how Taiwan democratizes, how in the end, when it gets to the late 1980s or 1986 was the day that, the year that the Democratic Progressive Party, the opposition party, formed. I mean, again, the Nationals still try to put people in jail, but they try to do it in a way that, because first of all, you're not going to stop international trade. That's actually propping up Taiwan, right? Because when you're getting marginalized and ostracized from the international community, these very powerful Taiwanese business people that have transnational connection of all these global businesses in the United States, in Japan, you cannot alienate these people. You can sort of, again, this is how, and this will be my sort of final point on this history. And I said that, if you look at what happened in China, with Deng Xiaoping's reform opening, of course they have Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and then now Xi Jinping. I don't see the same. I see the middle class, right? The rise of the middle class and the amazing economic developments and all of that. But what I don't see is this sort of sustained and united coalition of a group of people that went consistently against the government and can sort of flip that power relations, to have enough popular support. And so my final comment on this is that history is important.
Yeah,
History is very
we would agree.
important in
From
our
the historian
understanding
himself.
of- yeah.
Yeah, no, but I mean, thank you for the reminder that democratization is certainly not a linear process. It is not, a process that happens sort of outside of other contexts. But I think sort of where we ended that brings us to really neatly to kind of our final stop in this sprint through Taiwanese history.
Yes.
And that is, of course, Taiwan's first democratic election in 1996 for president, and then its first actual transfer of power between parties in 2000. And so in future episodes, of course, we're going to get into some of kind of, I guess you could say, the politics of Taiwan and things like that. But I would really love, from your more historical standpoint, if you could talk about the significance of those milestones happening, in such quick succession, just 10 years after the end of martial law.
Those are sort of more recent development, right? But we can still consider them as history because they happened
Modern day history.
Yeah.
20, 30. Yeah, modern day history. It happened 20, 30 years ago, right? And point that I think is the most important is like for 1996 and the 2000s, right? Of course, you can look at them as milestones, right? Lee get elected, first Taiwanese president, although he was still sort of Japanese, and then you have Chen Shui-bian, the Democratic Progressive Party, the opposition in power, and again, in the minds of political scientists, that's a completion of what we call the democratic transition, right? Multi-party competition. Yeah, like I think you guys should know those better than I am. My position on this is that it's what a majority of the Taiwanese actually wanted, and you cannot stop this happened really organically, right? So the major point about this first decade of Taiwanese politics when they become a democracy, there's this process of democratization, right? It seems pretty chaotic with a lot of events, What remains unchanged and getting enlarged in a sense is the Taiwanese own sense of their Taiwan-based identity, right? And in a sense, that's something what most people really wanted back then. Is still what most people really want, and whether it's Lee or Chen Shui-bian, they basically facilitate or they reform in a way that allow for this to happen, right? And so they go hand in hand. the process of democratization and the process of, Taiwanization. And under that, the idea that if you basically, no matter where you come from, right? If you see Taiwan as your home and you identify with this place, and then you are Taiwanese, or as they call back then, the new Taiwanese.
No, that's, I mean, such a good way to kind of bookend the story, right? I know history is never that neat, that there is sort of a predetermined start and finish, but I think starting with this mass chaos where so many people, the decision was not up to them in 1949 about what happened to their lives up until something like 1996, where for the first time, the majority of people were able to decide what they wanted Taiwan to look like. I think that's kind of a great way to think about sort of the arc of democratization in Taiwan.
Yeah, and I think, you made so many really good points throughout our conversation. I mean, definitely the one about history being important, right? I mean, the collective memory in Taiwan is still this very recent history. Even if younger generations, will now learn about it through textbooks, through stories of from their parents and grandparents, right? I mean, I still learn about this from my own grandparents who experienced this, my parents who experienced this democratic transition. But ultimately, I think, your point about this identity, which is something that we will continue to explore in future episodes. But you're exactly right? What does it mean, to have had all this history happen to you in your home? And what is the kind of vision forward that you want to carry forth for your society, your community, and ultimately your country? And again, awesome topics for future discussions, but I just really want to thank you for highlighting that because I think that is definitely a big part of the story about Taiwan that we're trying to tell, right? Regardless of what happened in history, the democratization movement happened, the democratic transition happened, and people chose to choose their future way of life, right? And so, yeah, I think all of this is just so important to discuss. But we have one final question for you.
Yeah, I think, obviously we learned so much over the course of this conversation, really valuable from start to finish. But to kind of end things on a lighter note, of course, the spirit of our podcast, Strait Forward, is really about bringing Taiwan to a wider audience here in the U.S., around the world. And so we want to kind of bring our guests into that by asking them to recommend something that you think might help people get to know Taiwan better. And it could be a book, a movie, anything really that you think for you encapsulates something important about Taiwan.
And I would love to do that. And in fact, that, when we are having this like pre-recording conversation, I mentioned that I actually have 4 books that I want to recommend to them.
Yeah, please do.
And the name of the book, it's called Becoming Taiwanese, Ethnogenesis in a Colonial City, 1880s to 1950s. Maybe some of the listeners or you would have, heard of the book. It's by a historian, a sort of a young historian like me, Evan Dawley. So Dawley. It's a relatively new book. It's published by Harvard University Press in 2019. Now, this is an amazing book, which, sort of try to get to the bottom of this debate that if there is this shared Taiwan identity that sort of developed under the Japanese rule, and it's not yet this national Taiwanese identity that we come to know today, what was it exactly? Did the Taiwanese still identify to a certain degree, like looked at their Chinese cultural heritage, or they have basically gone, like, I mean, the idea is, it's not that, it's not faux Japanese. So what is it? What's the origins of this sort of development of Taiwan identity, right? And Evan calls it ethnogenesis. And he's look at the city of Geelong with all these Taiwanese elites, their cultural activities, especially the temples, the temple culture, which they really try to sort of preserve and promote. So it's great social history.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Dominic, Professor Yang, again, for your time and for sharing what we all know is really important history, right, for our listeners to understand. And I think you did a really good job of helping us lay the foundation for our podcast moving forward. because with this basis in history, we can now talk about the more complicated modern day issues of national security, of economic security, of the technologies that have helped Taiwan's economy grow, right? So all of these things could not have happened without this historical foundation and this, again, process of democratization. So really, thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed this conversation.
Wow, that was a tremendously educational conversation that we had with Professor Yang. And I just really appreciate his ability to explain these different pockets of history that happened to form that story of how Taiwan ended up where it is today. I do want to point out, though, for our listeners and I guess for ourselves as we continue to comprehend what we just talked about, that Taiwan's democratization did not happen in a vacuum, right? There was so much else going on around the world that Dominic did end up alluding to, right? At some point, the United States also had a role in Taiwan's history. They when the United States ended up switching its formal recognition of China, quote unquote China, to the People's Republic of China, the government in Beijing, right? That had an impact on Taiwan's role in the world, and also kind of solidified, I guess, the future of U.S.-Taiwan relationship, the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations, right? That's something that continues to be really close today. But that initial shock of transferring that recognition, really did set the stage for our current era of relations with Taiwan. A couple other things that happened right during that entire period of Taiwan going from authoritarianism to democracy. Right, you had the Vietnam War and the Korean War. You had the Cold War, broader Cold War, right, between the United States and the Soviet Union. You had that competition to kind of define that future world order. You have SCSP's origin story playing out, right, with Kissinger and Prospects for America and the original Special Studies Project that's also happened during this period, right? So much happened during this period around the world at the same time where Taiwan was experiencing this transition from authoritarianism to democracy. So I just want to highlight that because I think it is remarkable that'll happen in the context of this greater global shift towards a more open world.
Yeah, and I think maybe to take it in the other direction, one thing I really appreciated about Dominic's story through those decades is kind of the human element of it, right? I think sometimes we imagine history as happening to people, when I think he really flipped that on its head and how people shape history, right? Democratization didn't happen because somebody woke up someday and decided Taiwan was going to be a democracy. It happened through the actions of so many people, working in so many ways towards a political system in a country that they felt reflected their aspirations, right? And I think that's why Taiwan's democratic story, no matter where you are in the world, is so important, and why Taiwan's democracy is worth us working together to safeguard.
Yeah, well, with that, for our next few episodes, we'll start getting into the meat of the tech and all that. But for now, that's all for today's episode, and we look straight forward to seeing you next time.